Fort Lewis Indian School was a typical Indian boarding school. The U.S. government operated 24 off-reservation boarding schools and then several hundred day schools. That doesn't even include church-run schools either. So there were hundreds of boarding schools that took in Indian children. Stories of kidnapping are told by the families being picked up and taken to boarding school, and parents finding out later that you can't have your child back. Parents could have their rations withheld until they were compelled to send their child or children to school. These rations, annual annuities of cash payments, were already promised in treaties. The goal of off-reservation boarding schools was to be at a greater distance from the communities.
So basically, it's assimilation. My biological parents and my aunts and uncles attended these boarding schools. So when they spoke in Navajo, they were punished or they were beaten. And when I ask my mother questions about her experience, she doesn't elaborate too much.
Children found ways to survive, and some of those ways of surviving meant that you lost your indigenous language. And so it would be very alienating to return home. So the goal really was to remove the cultural markers, to have children not know their spiritual teachings so that they would be these cultural blanks that could be reworked and made in the image of the dominant society. And the historical record for Fort Lewis Indian School is incomplete, but in the few years that we do have records of, I've tracked, several dozen children who have died while attending Fort Lewis Indian School. Recently in Canada, a few dozen grave sites have been located in Kamloops, British Columbia. And then now that number has swelled to over 5,000 graves that have been located in Canada. But in the U.S., we're getting to that point where we're acknowledging and understanding the history of Indian school. And now the follow-up is to put forward the same energy into finding and locating children who didn't survive Indian boarding school, that they are buried having never been returned to their families. I know for Dakota people and for my Dakota community, we know that children join their ancestors. Just give me a moment. It's just kind of hard because everyone has a connection to a relative.
With this discovery, we knew that we were going to be asked questions about the old fort site. Students and community members and tribal members were asking what types of unmarked burials are at the old fort site. And that was a question that we don't have an answer to. But we were aware that there were children who perished there, which has led to additional questions about how we will survey the area, but we're being very deliberate and we're being very intentional about how we want to work with tribal nations, really respecting tribal sovereignty and bringing tribal nations into the conversation about how they want to proceed. And that would be Southern Ute Indian Tribe, Hickory Apache, Mescalero Apache, and the Navajo Nation. Other tribes, such as some of the pueblos in New Mexico, may have sent children here, but that has not been determined. These are really deliberate conversations and very delicate and sensitive and emotional conversations that we need to have with tribal nations. And that's why we're not rushing into this. And so we are planning to have those conversations in the next year and to determine how we can move forward with how we can conduct the surveying.
So Fort Lewis College, we have a clock tower, and underneath the clock tower are 3 panels, each depicting eras of Fort Lewis history. Fort Lewis as a military post, Fort Lewis as Indian Industrial School, then a 2-year agricultural and mechanics college, the depictions of Indian boarding school. Some of the language casts a positive light on Indian schools in general, and as Fort Lewis being, very a good thing that happened to Native people. And of course, we know that that's not the case. There's a darker history that those panels don't fully encapsulate.
When you look at those photos, none of the children are smiling.
I was just puzzled as to why these panels, they were there when I was an undergrad and hadn't changed. And as an undergrad, I was not happy about what was being projected on our boarding school history. It just painted a very rosy experience for the people at that time, which wasn't the case. I decided to chat with a few other faculty members to get their insight, and then drafted an email to President Stritikus on how we could be more inclusive as a campus. When I was putting the email together, I had to revisit some of my own family history of my grandparents who had to go to boarding schools throughout the U.S. So for me, it was very important and personal, and I knew that I wasn't the only one as a faculty or staff, but also a lot of our students have that in our history.
And she was right, and that's what led to the genesis of the formation of the History and Reconciliation Committee at Fort Lewis College.
A committee that was tasked with the charge to figure out, what could we do with these panels? How do we have a community-driven discussion? And how do we get insight from not just students, faculty, and staff, but the greater community who was impacted by this through generations?
I don't think I understood the depth of trauma that was caused by boarding schools. I don't think I understood the inconsistency in which we portrayed the history of boarding schools. Fort Lewis College is undertaking an examination of its past because we are very deliberately thinking about our future. We serve over 40% Native American students, and part of serving those students successfully means that we're creating a climate of well-being and belonging on campus. But an aspect of that is being honest about our history, being honest about the trauma caused by federal Indian boarding schools, being honest about the loss of language, the loss of culture that deliberately were a part of the boarding school movement, being honest about how that impacts our faculty, staff, and our current Native American students.
A lot of folks I found when I was a student didn't know about the history, so I would always have to say something in class. I would rather have students learn in a safe space, have everyone know about our history. If we all understood it, then I think we would have a greater appreciation for each other as a campus.
For the ceremony, we will have the removal and a replacement of other panels as placeholders until we determine what will be put there permanently. And the ceremonial program is really about inviting tribal leaders and elders to provide a blessing and an acknowledgement of that history, and then the removal will allow for the birth of a new chapter in the college's history and evolution.
I think just taking them down would have let Fort Lewis off the hook. It would have potentially hidden something that we should have questioned. Why did we think it was okay to present this very whitewashed version of history? Why did we think that was okay? And what does that say about where we are and where we've been?
So to just simply tear them down and destroy them or throw them in the trash doesn't allow for that conversation to happen. The college has been, this past 2 academic years have been really in just the initial process of acknowledging even its own history as an Indian boarding school. So the clock tower panels really were the tipping point for that conversation to happen. And so the president, spearheaded an initiative for a campus-wide conversation in several town halls. We did that prior to the pandemic, and the pandemic, put our plans aside for another year. And so we're coming back to it this year to remove those clock tower panels, to talk about Fort Lewis Indian School history in more transparent ways. And we are taking our time, we're not in a rush to hurry it along, because that too can be equally damaging.
My own interpretation of reconciliation will be different from others. As I see it for Fort Lewis, it would be giving students the same opportunity that their peers would have. So if you're an Indigenous student or a student from those historically underrepresented, I want those students to have an experience that some of their white peers would have, so they don't have to have these stressors outside of school. And if that's having everyone learn about the history of our institution, even though it's not the best. For me, reconciliation is just acknowledging the history, educating everyone about that.
The ideas are coming in on what we can put in place of those panels. Could it be Indigenous artwork? Could it be a more accurate portrayal of that era?